They say karma doesn't always arrive on schedule, but when it does, it tends to make a mess. Nick Reiner, Hollywood royalty, privileged son of legendary director Rob Reiner, an accused double murderer, was found dead inside his prison cell. Not just dead, stabbed, brutally, repeatedly, a grotesque echo of the very crime that landed him behind bars in the first place. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The cause: multiple sharp force injuries. The manner: homicide. The message? Well, that's the part still sending shockwaves through Los Angeles County and beyond. But how did we get here? How did a 32-year-old man, once shielded by wealth, connections, and rehab stints, end up lying in a pool of blood on a prison cot, his body riddled with over a dozen stab wounds, and no signs of forced entry? Let's rewind, because nothing about this story is simple. In fact, everything about it. Every chilling detail, every twist, every silence, and every scream is steeped in irony, darkness, and unanswered questions. Because when police first showed up to the $13.5 million Reiner estate that chilly Sunday evening, they didn't expect to walk into a crime scene so gruesome it would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. They didn't expect to find Hollywood's golden couple, Rob and Michelle Reiner, slaughtered in their own home. And they certainly didn't expect to find their son, Nick, calm, blood-spattered, standing barefoot in the hallway with a dazed expression on his face. What happened next felt like something straight out of one of Rob Reiner's movies. Except this wasn't scripted, in the ending. It just got darker. Now, weeks later, with Nick's own blood staining the walls of a prison cell, people are asking, did he deserve it? Or was someone trying to silence him before he could speak? Because here's the thing. Nick said something to police the night he was arrested. Just 6 words. And those 6 words have become the backbone of every conspiracy theory, every Reddit thread, every jailhouse rumor. They made me do it. They wouldn't stop. Who is they? Is it voices in his head? Or real people in his life? Was it guilt? Was it trauma? Or was it someone, or something, pulling the strings from the shadows? You see, this isn't just about a murder, or even a murder-suicide. This is about legacy. About Hollywood power. About a family that was supposed to have it all: wealth, fame, respect, and somehow ended up dead, disgraced, and forgotten in less than 30 days. And now, the only person who could have told us what really happened that night at the Brentwood estate is dead too. But let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a crime scene echo itself? Because that's what this looks like. The Reiner parents, stabbed to death. The Reiner son, stabbed to death. Some say it's justice. Some say it's irony. But others are saying something far more terrifying. That the same hand held both knives. Now let's be real. That sounds like a stretch, doesn't it? After all, Nick was locked up. Solitary, no visitors, under 24/7 surveillance. So how did he end up with multiple sharp force injuries if no one else was there? And why did the prison's security footage mysteriously cut out exactly 42 minutes before his body was discovered? No backup power. No explanation. Just darkness. And when the cameras came back online, Nick Reiner was lying face up, eyes wide open, a half-written letter in his hand that simply read, "Forgive me, Romy." That's his sister, the one who found the bodies, the one who allegedly warned the police that a dangerous family member should be a suspect, the one who's gone completely silent since her brother's death. So now we have a trail of blood, a broken family, a missing truth, and a dead man who might have known more than he was ever allowed to say. This story, it's not over, not even close. Because if you look closely, the answers were always there. In the journals, in the wounds, in the silences between screams. And what's coming next might finally explain why a Hollywood dream turned into a nightmare, and why someone may have decided that Nick Reiner was better off dead. So stay with me. Because we're about to peel back the curtain on one of the most disturbing, complicated, and emotional cases to hit the entertainment world since the Manson murders. You think you know the story of Rob Reiner and his family? You don't. Not yet. Because what happened before Nick's death, what happened behind the headlines in that Brentwood house, and later, in the quiet corners of a prison cell, is something no one in Hollywood ever wanted exposed. And yet here we are. With a crime scene that reads like a Shakespearean tragedy, a family ripped apart, a son silenced, a sister grieving, and a legacy forever stained with blood. But what if I told you this wasn't the first time something like this happened in their family? What if I told you there were warning signs years ago, signs no one wanted to believe? And what if I told you that just days before his death, Nick Reiner tried to confess something no one wanted to hear? A confession buried under gag orders. A confession that may have cost him his life. Because what the coroner found in Nick's body wasn't just stab wounds. It was something else. Something placed deliberately. Something small, but damning. And it's that discovery that's now fueling the investigation all over again. So now we ask the question, was this revenge? Redemption? A cover-up? Or the final act in a twisted family tragedy that's still unraveling? And what exactly did Nick mean by they wouldn't stop? Because if they are still out there, who's next? Have you ever heard of a last name that feels like a brand? Not a name, but a legacy? That's what Reiner was in Hollywood. Not just a man, not just a filmmaker. Rob Reiner was a cultural force, an institution, a man whose fingerprints are on some of the most iconic, heartfelt, and timeless films in American cinema. So how does a name like that, synonymous with laughter, love, and legacy, end up splashed across crime scene photos, prison mugshots, and now a homicide report from inside a maximum security cell? The answer starts decades ago. Because long before the blood, long before the screams in Brentwood, there was fame. Unshakable, untouchable, and incredibly fragile. Rob Reiner didn't just grow up in Hollywood. He was practically born on the backlit. Son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, Rob was raised on studio sets and laugh tracks. From an early age, the spotlight was familiar. The language of scripts, takes, edits, and applause, that was bedtime routine. And when Rob landed the role of Michael Meathead Stivic on All in the Family, he didn't just become a household name. He became a political symbol, a comedic icon, and a generational voice. And from there, the man became a director of dreams. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, Misery. It was an unmatched run. Critics adored him. Studios trusted him. Fans followed him. But what happens when a man who's spent his life telling stories fails to tell the truth about the one unfolding in his own home? Now let's talk about Michelle Singer Reiner, Rob's wife of over 3 decades. Not as public, not as praised, but just as powerful behind the scenes. A producer, a philanthropist, a mother, and, according to those closest to the family, the emotional heartbeat of the Reiner household. While Rob made magic on set, Michelle kept things stable at home. She protected their children fiercely, especially one, the one who needed it the most. Nick. Nick Reiner was the baby of the family, the sensitive one, the one people always said had a mind like his dad's and a heart like his mom's. But something didn't click. Early reports from childhood friends described Nick as brilliant but volatile, charming, yet self-destructive, sweet until he wasn't. There were tantrums, outbursts, a short fuse, a long history of emotional fragility. But here's the twist. Despite all that, the Reiners protected him. Again, and again, and again. When Nick was caught with weed at 15, it was teenage curiosity. When he crashed his car at 16, an accident. When he got expelled from boarding school, he needed a better fit. Sound familiar? Rich families have their own ways of spinning dysfunction. They call it eccentricity. They say he's just creative. He's misunderstood. And with the Reiner name behind you, doors don't just open, they bow. But let's pause here. Let's ask a real question. What happens to a kid who never hears no? Who never has to suffer the consequences of his own mistakes? What kind of adult does that create? Because by the time Nick hit his 20s, the cracks weren't just showing, they were splintering. Multiple stints in rehab, a near-fatal overdose in 2016, an arrest that was buried quietly behind settlements and sealed records. And still, the family rallied. Michelle reportedly told a friend, "He's going to get better. He just needs time. We all heal in different ways." But healing only happens when there's truth. And truth, in the Reiner house, was slippery. Behind closed doors, Nick's behavior was spiraling. Staffers at the Brentwood estate reported late-night screaming matches between him and his father. Broken glass, holes in the walls. One mate allegedly quit on the spot after seeing Nick throw a plate at his mother during a dinner argument. And yet, no police reports, no charges, no intervention. Why? Because when your last name is Reiner, silence is golden. And secrets are sacred. But secrets, as we now know, don't stay buried forever. Now here's something no one talks about: Nick's attempt at redemption. In 2015, after one of his longer stints in rehab, he co-wrote a semi-autobiographical film titled Being Charlie, about a troubled teen navigating addiction, family dysfunction, and the struggle for self-worth. It was supposed to be his comeback, his apology, his transformation. Rob Reiner directed it. Nick wrote it. Critics called it honest and raw, but those closest to the production said it was anything but. One crew member leaked a memo describing the set as tense, chaotic, and emotionally manipulative. Nick allegedly had several breakdowns. Production was delayed. His sobriety didn't last. And after the film flopped, he disappeared. For years, Nick lived quietly in the guest house of his parents' estate. Or so it seemed. Neighbors saw him pacing outside at night. Others heard screaming. Some saw him digging in the backyard late at night. One Uber driver claimed Nick rambled about cleansing rituals and sacrifices during a ride to a pharmacy. Another said he refused to speak at all, just stared. So again, we ask, why was he still there? Why did Rob and Michelle let him stay? Was it guilt? Was it love? Or was it fear? Let's revisit something chilling. An old quote from an interview Rob Reiner gave in 2020. Family is everything. But sometimes, what you love the most can also destroy you the fastest. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, it reads like a prophecy, because just a few years later, that same family would lie butchered in their own home. And now, Nick Reiner, their youngest son, the man accused of stabbing them to death, is himself dead. Found in his cell, multiple stab wounds, classified as homicide. Is it a tragic end? A twisted loop of poetic justice? Or the final act of a much larger, much darker play? Because let's not forget, this wasn't just a troubled man. This was the son of Rob Reiner, the heir to a Hollywood dynasty. And maybe that's what makes this entire story even more difficult to grasp. Because we've seen scandals. We've seen crimes. We've seen celebrity meltdowns. But this is legacy warfare. This is a man born in the Hollywood Hills, dying on a cold prison floor, bleeding out from the very thing he once wielded himself. And what came next would make even the most cynical, most jaded journalists stop and say, wait, are you serious? Because when police finally opened Nick's private study after his death, they didn't just find notebooks and family photos. They found a name no one expected, a name tied to something even the Reiner family never saw coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever walked past a house so perfect it feels like a movie set? Clean white stucco walls, black iron gates, lush hedges trimmed with military precision, balconies that overlook silence, a pool that reflects the stars like they belong to you. That's what the Reiner estate looked like, at least from the outside. $13.5 million. Brentwood. The kind of neighborhood where secrets stay hidden behind tennis courts and tinted windows. Where celebrity status is matched only by the silence of neighbors who know everything and say nothing. But on the night of Sunday, December 14th, that silence shattered. And what officers found behind the black gates of 147 Maplewood Drive was nothing short of cinematic horror. It started at 7:06 p.m. A 911 call from inside the home. The voice? Female. Shaking. Gasping. Identified later as Romy Reiner. 27 years old, the only daughter of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Her words were blurred by panic, but clear enough to trigger the response of 4 patrol units. They're dead. There's blood everywhere. My brother's here. He's not saying anything. Please hurry. She didn't scream. She whispered, like someone terrified she was still being watched. When officers arrived less than 6 minutes later, what they walked into wasn't just a crime scene. It was a message. The main house was eerily quiet. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no struggle. But inside, Rob Reiner lay slumped in the corner of the library, eyes wide, a single deep stab wound to the chest. Michelle was on the kitchen floor, covered in blood, with multiple wounds to the abdomen. The room smelled like copper. The lights were still on. Dinner was half prepped on the stove. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing moved. No broken glass. No bloody footprints. Just death. Clean. Silent. Intentional. And standing in the hallway, barefoot, wearing a stained gray t-shirt and shaking ever so slightly, was Nick. Here's where it gets stranger. Nick wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He didn't even resist. When officers approached, guns drawn, shouting commands, he didn't flinch. He just looked up and said, "They made me do it." They wouldn't stop. 6 words. And not 1 ounce of emotion. Was he high? Was he psychotic? Was he possessed? The responding officer described him as blank. Like he wasn't even there. But the crime scene? That was anything but blank. Let's start with Rob. The autopsy would later confirm a single, lethal wound, 4.6 inches deep, piercing the heart. Clean, quick, efficient. But Michelle? She suffered 9 separate stab wounds, mostly around the abdomen and chest. 2 of them had penetrated the lungs. 1 clipped her liver, meaning she suffered. She tried to fight. There were bruises on her forearms, defensive wounds on her palms. She saw her killer. And unless you believe in masked intruders or ghosts, the only person in that house that night was her son, Nick. But remember, this wasn't just any house. This was the Reiner residence. Every hallway had motion sensors. Every window had smart locks. Every inch of that place had surveillance. Except, on the night of the murder, the cameras were off. Not damaged, not hacked, just turned off. Footage from earlier that day shows Michelle unlocking the system manually around 5:14 p.m. No one knows why. The last recorded image? Her hugging Nick in the driveway. She smiles. He doesn't. And then, nothing. So what happened between 5:14 p.m. and 7:06 p.m.? That's the hour police are still trying to reconstruct. But one thing is clear. The murders were personal. Not a robbery. Not a random attack. This was intimate, emotional, explosive. Investigators believe Rob was attacked first. He had a drink in his hand. Never saw it coming. Michelle was likely in the kitchen. She heard the thud. She ran. And what she walked in on? Her husband, lifeless. Her son, holding a knife. And she screamed. The knife used? A Japanese chef's knife from the Reiner's own kitchen. Nick didn't bring a weapon. He used theirs. Now let's talk about Romy. She wasn't home during the attack. She'd been staying at a friend's loft downtown for the weekend. But something made her come back that evening, unannounced. Some say she'd gotten a weird text from her mother. Others claim she'd been tracking Nick's behavior for weeks and was already on edge. Either way, she arrived at 6:59 p.m. What she saw was unforgettable. Blood trails in the hallway, her father's lifeless body in the library, and her brother sitting in the middle of the living room rug, rocking slowly, humming something. She called 911 from the hallway, crouched behind a sofa. Never approached him. Didn't dare. Because according to her later statement, the look in his eyes wasn't Nick. It was something else. I don't know how to explain it. It was like he was proud. Let that settle for a moment. Proud. What does it take to make someone proud of killing their parents? What had been brewing in that house for so long that it finally snapped into violence? Let's rewind a bit further. Neighbors report seeing emergency service vehicles at the Reiner home 3 separate times in the last 6 months. Each time, the story was the same. Nick had a panic attack. Nick had a fall. Nick got food poisoning. But now, with hindsight, people are asking if those visits were cover-ups. Were Rob and Michelle hiding something? Was Nick showing signs of violent intent? One family friend said Michelle had told her weeks earlier, "We're walking on eggshells. Every time he's calm, it feels like borrowed time. So why not kick him out? Why not cut him off? Why not report him?" That's the million-dollar question. And the answer seems to be the most tragic one of all. They loved him, even when it got bad, even when it got dangerous. They were still holding on to hope. Hope that he'd recover. Hope that he'd change. Hope that they could protect him from the world and from himself. But in trying to protect him, they may have doomed themselves. Because Nick wasn't just unstable. He was spiraling. And he was starting to believe something no one could reason with. You see, just 2 days before the murders, Nick had made a journal entry. It wasn't discovered until later, hidden in the bottom drawer of a cabinet in the guest house. The entry read, "There is rot in the house. They won't listen. They never did. If I can't fix it, I'll burn it down." At first glance, it reads like poetry. But after the murders, it sounds like a manifesto. Detectives believe this wasn't a moment of rage. It was premeditated. Not weeks in advance. Maybe not even days. But enough time to plot, to wait for Romy to leave, to isolate his parents. and strike, which leads us to the final, chilling detail of that night. When Nick was taken into custody, the officers found something tucked into his waistband. A folded piece of paper. On it, one word: cleanse. No explanation, no context, just that single word. It was written in his own handwriting, backwards, like he'd stared at it in the mirror before the attack. Police haven't released any further details on what it means. But those who knew Nick say he'd used that word often in his darker moods. I need to cleanse the energy. This family needs cleansing. They poisoned me. It's time to cleanse it out. Was this religious mania? Mental illness? Or something darker? Something ritualistic? Something passed down? Because as disturbing as the murders were, what investigators would find next would suggest this wasn't just about anger. This was about legacy, about symbolism, about something hidden deep within the Reiner bloodline. And when detectives searched the guest house the next morning, what they discovered would shake even the most seasoned cop. Have you ever heard a whisper so unsettling it felt louder than a scream? That's exactly what happened when Nick Reiner muttered those 6 words. They made me do it. They wouldn't stop. He didn't shout them. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink when he said it. Just a whisper, barely audible above the hum of chaos in the Reiner household. But those 6 words changed everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about murder. It was about motive. And the motive, if Nick was to be believed, didn't come from hate, but from something much stranger. Something inside him. Or something around him. Let's back up. When detectives heard Nick's words, they didn't know what to think. Was it a confession? A warning? A delusion? They had a double homicide. They had a suspect covered in blood. They had a weapon from the kitchen with his fingerprints. But what they didn't have was a reason. Until Nick spoke again, this time at the station. And what he said there, that's when things got eerie. The audio from Nick's initial police interview hasn't been officially released, but insiders claim one chilling moment has already leaked, and it's spreading like wildfire in certain circles. According to the transcript, during the interview, the detective leaned forward and asked, "Nick, did you kill your parents?" Nick paused, and then, with a calm voice and a half-smile, he said, "They've been dead a long time." The detective replied, "What do you mean? They were alive 2 hours ago." Nick looked up and said, "No, not really. They died when they stopped listening. This was just the funeral." What do you even do with a statement like that? Is it a metaphor? Madness? Or something far more chilling? A belief that whatever they were had already taken his parents away? Now let's be clear. Nick Reiner had a documented history of mental illness. Bipolar disorder, substance-induced psychosis, borderline personality disorder traits. His records, some of which were leaked anonymously after his arrest, paint the picture of a young man in turmoil for years. But even so, his words weren't entirely incoherent. In fact, they were disturbingly poetic, almost rehearsed. That's what threw detectives off. They weren't ramblings. They were messages, which led investigators to search for patterns. And what they found might be one of the strangest twists in this already twisted story. Deep inside the guest house, hidden behind a bookshelf, was Nick's personal recording studio. Nothing fancy, just a microphone, a laptop, a soundproof wall. But what was inside the computer? That's where things got strange. Dozens of audio files, unlabeled, unsorted, unstructured, except for one folder, titled simply, Cleanse. Detectives listened to the first file, and according to the leaked internal report, what they heard was not Nick, at least not at first. The first few seconds were static, then a low hum, then a voice, distorted, mechanical, whispering. "End it. Let them go. You know it's time." Then silence, and then Nick's voice, soft, terrified, saying, "I can't. Not yet. Not while she's still watching." Another whisper, "She'll understand. She always knew. You're just finishing what they started." It was like eavesdropping on a conversation between Nick and something else. Some online sleuths believe Nick was role-playing, acting out scripts, or creating experimental audio art. But others? They believe it was something more. Something paranormal. Let's be honest. At this point, the line between reality and madness is paper thin. And yet, Nick's digital footprint only raises more questions. Emails never sent. Notes to himself titled The Watcher, The Burn, and Harvest. And a draft of an unsent email to his sister Romy with the subject line, "If I disappear, don't look for me. Look under me." What does that mean? At first glance, it sounds like suicide ideation, maybe paranoia. But investigators took it literally. And when they began digging, literally digging, under the guest house floorboards, they found something no one was prepared for. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a weapon. It was a box. A small, wooden lockbox, covered in dried wax, with strange carvings on the lid. Inside, 3 items. A black and white photo of Michelle Reiner as a child, eyes scratched out with red ink. A journal page that read, "She was the first. I was just the echo." A burned matchstick, wrapped in a piece of baby blue ribbon. What does it mean? To this day, no one knows. Psychologists say it's symbolic. Detectives say it's evidence. Romy Reiner said nothing. She just wept. But the press? The press couldn't get enough. Because when those details leaked, that's when the internet lost its mind. Reddit threads exploded. TikTok sleuths dissected every sentence. YouTube conspiracy channels hit record views. Everyone had a theory. Was Nick part of a cult? Was this a generational curse? Was he acting out a script buried in childhood trauma? Some claimed Michelle had been involved in esoteric spiritual practices. Others dug up old interviews where Rob spoke about cleansing negative energy and burning bad cycles. Suddenly, Nick's obsession with the word cleanse didn't seem random. It seemed inherited, or taught. But then came the true internet-breaking moment. A prison nurse, speaking anonymously, claimed that in the days after Nick's arrest, he didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just stared at the wall and whispered to himself. And one phrase kept repeating, "I still hear her breathing." When asked who her was, Nick reportedly smiled and replied, "She never left the house. You locked her in. She's in the walls." Now, is this psychosis or confession? And more importantly, who is she? Michelle? Romy? Someone else entirely? We still don't know. But what came next only deepened the mystery. 3 nights after the murder, a short audio clip appeared on a dark web forum. It was allegedly pulled from Nick's computer, one of the files titled wake_3m_final.wave. The voice in the recording? Recognized as Michelle Reiner's. The content? She's heard saying, "Nick, you have to stop. You're scaring us. This isn't the way." Then Nick's voice, calm, low, emotionless. "It's always been the way. You just didn't want to see it." Then static. Then a loud bang. Audio ends. Was this real? Experts are divided. Some claim it's fabricated, AI-generated, spliced from interviews. But others point to metadata from the leaked file, showing timestamps just 2 days before the murders. If authentic, it means Michelle knew something was wrong. It means she tried to stop it. And it means Nick was far more lucid and far more dangerous than anyone realized. But here's the kicker. The whisper, those original 6 words, they made me do it. They wouldn't stop. That whisper wasn't isolated, because after Nick's death in prison, another inmate came forward. Said he heard Nick whispering the same phrase in his sleep, over and over and over. Even stranger, he claimed Nick would sometimes pause and whisper a different sentence. She said the fire would end it. Fire? Nothing in the house was burned. No arson, no flames. But then, investigators remembered something odd from the night of the murder. The fireplace in the guest house was on. In December. In Los Angeles. Nothing strange about that, until you consider this. It hadn't been cold that night. In fact, the thermostat was set to 74 degrees Fahrenheit. So why light a fire? What was Nick trying to destroy? Or who? The more we dig, the more twisted it gets. Because this whisper? It wasn't just a moment of madness. It was a breadcrumb. A clue in a story that's still unraveling. And when the autopsy came back after Nick's death, it revealed one final, chilling detail. Something found tucked inside the waistband of his prison uniform. Something so disturbing. The coroner had to take a break mid-examination. But we'll get to that. Because before we open that envelope, we have to ask one more question. Was Nick Reiner insane or initiated? And when Romy finally broke her silence days later, she didn't give us answers. She gave us something far more terrifying. A warning. Before we go any further, let's pause, because this chapter marks a shift. What you're about to hear is part of a fictionalized true crime narrative, a dramatized reconstruction inspired by public fascination with celebrity tragedies. Names, scenes, recordings, and events are presented as storytelling, not verified fact. This matters because the power of this chapter isn't in what's provable, but in what it makes us question. Now, with that said, let me ask you something. What if the scariest thing about that night wasn't the knife? What if it was the voices? Because when investigators finally turned their attention to the guest house, the place Nick had been living, hiding, unraveling, they expected to find chaos. What they found instead was order. Too much order. The guest house sat about 30 yards from the main house, separated by hedges and a stone walkway. From the outside, it looked harmless, minimalist, clean, almost sterile. No broken windows, no overturned furniture, no blood, but the air inside felt wrong. Detectives would later describe it as pressurized, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then there was the silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind that buzzes. The first thing they noticed was the soundproofing. Foam panels lined one entire wall of the living area. Not professional studio grade, but close. Enough to muffle screams. Enough to keep conversations from traveling. Why would someone living alone need that? Then they found the equipment. A laptop. A condenser microphone. A compact audio interface. Nothing illegal. Nothing exotic. But the way it was arranged told a story. The mic wasn't positioned for music. It was angled toward a chair in the center of the room. A single chair. No desk. Just a chair. Like an interrogation setup. Or a confessional. Now here's where the title of this chapter earns its name. When investigators opened the laptop, they didn't find one or two recordings. They found hundreds. Short clips. Long monologues. Fragments. Whispers. Arguments. Some were Nick talking to himself. Others sounded like conversations. But not in the way you'd expect. Let's talk about the first file they played. Timestamped. 2:43 a.m. 3 nights before the murders. At first, it's just breathing. Slow. Uneven. Close to the mic. Then Nick's voice. I can't sleep. You said it would stop. A pause. Then another voice. Lower. Calmer. Almost soothing. You're doing well. This part is always the hardest. Nick responds, sharper now. No. You said once I understood, it would be quiet. Another pause. The voice replies. It is quiet. You're just afraid of what quiet sounds like. Silence. Then Nick whispers. Don't wake them. Audio cuts. Let that sink in. Who is them? And more importantly, who is answering him? Now, skeptics were quick to jump in. They said it was roleplay, audio art, a man with mental illness creating characters. That's a fair argument, until you listen to the patterns. Because the voice responding to Nick, it never changes. Not in pitch, not in cadence, not in rhythm. Across dozens of recordings, it's the same voice. And it never overlaps with Nick's speech, as if it's waiting its turn. One detective reportedly joked, nervously, sounds like he was recording phone calls with God. No one laughed, because as they kept listening, the tone shifted. The conversations got darker. Another file, timestamped, 11:17 p.m., 2 nights before the murders. Nick sounds agitated. They're watching me again. They think I don't see it. The voice responds. They watch because they're afraid. You're stronger now. Nick, I don't want to hurt them. Voice, you won't. You'll free them. Nick, that's what you said last time. Long silence. Voice, finally. And it worked. Last time? What last time? Investigators froze the playback. Because this wasn't just disturbed self-talk anymore. This was narrative, continuity, history. Here's where things get even more unsettling. The recordings weren't made randomly. They followed a schedule. Almost every night, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., Nick recorded. Always alone. Always in the same chair. Always addressing the same unseen presence. And sometimes, very rarely, you could hear something else. A sound beneath the voices. Like movement. A creak. A soft knock. As if someone was walking in the main house. Now remember, the guest house was close enough to hear faint noises from inside the estate. Footsteps. Doors. Pipes. So maybe that's all it was. Maybe. But then there was the file that changed everything. File name, don't play this for her. It's the longest recording. 23 minutes. Nick starts calm. Almost peaceful. I think I'm ready. The voice replies, gentle. I know. Nick, will it hurt? Voice, only for a moment. Nick, and after? Voice, after, there will be quiet. The kind you've been asking for. Nick exhales. Then he says something that made every person in that room stop breathing. But what about Romy? Silence. Longer than before. Then the voice answers. She already knows. That line hit investigators hard, because Romy had told them something during her statement, something that hadn't been released to the public. She'd said that for weeks before the murders, she felt like she was being watched in the house, lights turning on by themselves, doors she didn't remember opening, her name whispered when no one was there. She thought it was stress, or imagination, or guilt for leaving Nick alone with their parents. Now hearing that line, she already knows. It felt personal. At this point, detectives brought in audio analysts. They isolated the second voice, ran it through filters, compared it to Nick's voice at different pitches. The conclusion? Inconclusive. Some analysts said it could be Nick, slowed down and altered. Others said no. There were harmonic differences that didn't match. But here's the detail no one could explain. The voice never inhaled. Not once. Every human voice has breath patterns. This one, none detected. Now, before your mind runs too far, there are rational explanations. Noise suppression, editing artifacts, compression. But storytelling doesn't live on rationality alone. It lives on doubt. And doubt is exactly what these recordings created. Then came the smart speaker. The one in the kitchen of the main house. Remember that? Investigators hadn't forgotten. They pulled logs, voice activation history, and found something strange. The wake word had been triggered repeatedly late at night, but not with commands. Just talking, fragments, whispers, too quiet to transcribe fully, except for one phrase that appeared 3 times. Are you ready now? And a response? Almost. Now think about this. Nick is in the guest house. The smart speaker is in the main house. 2 separate locations, 2 separate devices. Yet the language matches. The timing overlaps. And the tone? Identical. Coincidence? Or coordination? At this point, the theory that Nick was completely alone in his delusions started to crack. Because delusions don't usually synchronize across devices, across rooms, across spaces, unless someone wanted them to. Let's talk about Michelle for a moment, because several recordings mention her indirectly. She's resisting. She's still holding on. She thinks love will stop it. And then, in one chilling clip, Nick says, almost pleading, "She's my mother." The voice replies, "She was." Now tell me, how does a man live in the same property as his parents, hear a voice telling him they're already gone, and not collapse under the weight of it? Unless he believed it. Unless, in his mind, the murders weren't an ending. They were a continuation. Which brings us back to that night. Because when Romy arrived at the house, she said she heard something before she saw anything. A low humming, coming from the guest house. Not music, not singing, just a single note. Sustained. She told police she thought it was Nick calming himself down. But now, knowing what we know, that sound takes on a different meaning. The voices in the guest house weren't just recordings. They were rehearsals, preparations, conversations leading toward a conclusion. And when that conclusion finally came, Nick didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He whispered, "They made me do it." And if those voices were real to him, whether born of illness, imagination, or something darker, then from his perspective, he wasn't a murderer. He was a messenger. But here's the final twist of this chapter. Because after Nick's death in prison, investigators returned to the guest house one last time. They powered up the laptop, just to confirm everything had been cataloged. And when the screen lit up, a new file appeared, time-stamped after Nick's death. File name, quiet, no audio, just static, and a single line of text in the metadata. You did well. Now ask yourself, who was still listening? And what did they want Nick to do next if he'd lived long enough to hear it? Because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the one person who may have understood all of this before anyone else. The one person who tried to warn them. The one person who lived in that house and left alive. Romy. And what she told police may be the most disturbing part of this entire story. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If you knew something terrible was coming, if you felt it in your bones, how long would you stay silent before you try to stop it? And what if the people you loved most refused to believe you? Because Romy Reiner didn't just walk into a crime scene that night. She walked into a nightmare she says had been stalking her for months. Romy didn't want to talk at first. Not to the press. Not to the public. Barely even to the police. When detectives sat across from her in the interview room, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't ask questions. She just stared at the table. And when the detective finally said, "Romy, we need to understand what was happening in that house," she replied with 6 words that sent a chill through the room. "I thought I was losing my mind." That was how her confession began. Not with accusations. Not with blame. With doubt. Romy told investigators that weeks before the murders, the house began to feel wrong. Not haunted. Not cursed. Just wrong. The air felt heavy. Rooms felt crowded even when they were empty. And silence didn't feel quiet. It felt intentional. She described it like this. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you interrupted a conversation that stopped when you arrived? That's how she said the house felt. Every day. At first, she blamed stress. Her family had been under pressure for years. Nick's instability, constant tension between him and their parents, the unspoken agreement to pretend everything was fine. But then the small things started. Her bedroom door would be open when she was sure she'd closed it. Lights flicked on in the hallway at night. The guest house lights stayed on until morning. And whenever she asked Nick about it, he'd smile. Not a friendly smile. A knowing one. Romy told police that the first time she truly got scared was 3 weeks before the murders. She was home alone with her mother. Rob and Nick were out. She was in the kitchen when she heard her name. Soft. Clear. Close. Romy. She turned. No one was there. She asked her mother if she'd called her. Michelle looked confused. "I thought you called me," she said. That was the moment Romy realized it wasn't just her. From that day on, Romy started documenting things. Not because she thought something supernatural was happening, but because she was afraid no one would believe her. She kept notes on her phone. Dates. Times. Feelings. Entries like, Nick pacing outside at 3:12 a.m. Guest house lights on again. Mom crying in her room. Won't say why. Dad says we're overreacting. And then, one entry stood out. Dated 10 days before the murders. Nick said, "You'll understand soon. Just don't be here when it happens." At the time, she thought it was emotional manipulation. Now, it sounds like a warning. Romy told detectives she confronted her parents. More than once. She begged them to make Nick leave the property, to force him into inpatient care, to call someone, anyone, who could intervene. But according to her statement, Rob brushed it off. He said Nick was fragile, that pushing him would make it worse. Michelle was quieter. She looked scared, but she kept saying love would bring him back. Romy's voice cracked when she said that, because love didn't bring him back. Love buried them. Here's where Romy's confession takes a darker turn. She told police that Nick didn't just scare her. He tested her. He'd say things he shouldn't know, things she hadn't told anyone, like the name of her childhood imaginary friend, or the song she listened to when she cried alone in her room, or the nightmare she'd had the night before. How would he know that? She asked detectives. I never told him. Sometimes he'd tilt his head and say, "You think you're alone in your thoughts?" And then he'd laugh. One night, 5 days before the murders, Romy said she woke up to whispering outside her bedroom door. 2 voices. One she recognized. Nick's. The other? She couldn't place it. She pressed her ear to the door, and she heard Nick say, "She's not ready yet." The other voice replied, "She doesn't need to be." Romy locked her door and didn't sleep until morning. She left the house the next day. That was the last time she slept there. Romy told police she didn't come back because she wanted space. She came back because she felt guilty, because the house went quiet after she left. Too quiet. Her mother stopped texting. Her father stopped calling. And Nick sent her one final message. Come home tonight. Or don't. Either way, it ends. She didn't understand what that meant. Not until she walked through the door and smelled blood. Now here's the part of Romy's confession that investigators struggled with the most. Because it wasn't about what she saw. It was about what she felt. She told them that when she entered the house, before she saw the bodies, before she saw Nick, she felt relief. Relief that it was finally over. And that terrified her. Does that make me a bad person? She asked. That moment is important. Because it suggests something was building long before that night. Something all of them felt. Something they were trapped inside. Romy also revealed something she hadn't told anyone until that interview. A memory from childhood. Nick was about 10 years old. She was 7. They were playing hide and seek in the house. She hid in a closet. Nick found her. But instead of tagging her, he closed the door and held it shut. She screamed. She begged. And through the door, she heard him say, "You can be quiet if you want." You just don't know how yet. Their parents laughed it off later. Kids being kids. But Romy remembered the fear, and she never forgot the words. When detectives asked her if she believed Nick killed their parents, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. But then she added, I don't think he thought he was killing them. That stopped the room. What do you mean? The detective asked. Romy swallowed hard. I think he thought he was helping them leave. Leave what? She didn't know. Or maybe she did, but couldn't say it out loud. The confession ended with one final detail, one that still hasn't been made public in any official report. Romy told detectives that as she hid behind the sofa, waiting for police to arrive, she heard Nick humming. Not randomly. The same tune their mother used to hum when they were children. A lullaby. And between the notes, she heard him whisper, It's quiet now. She was right. Romy said she didn't know who she was. But she knew one thing. Whatever Nick believed, whatever he'd been listening to, it didn't stop when their parents died. And it didn't stop when he went to prison. Because in the days after his arrest, Romy received something in the mail. No return address. Just a plain envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper. With one sentence written in Nick's handwriting. You should have stayed gone. Romy hasn't spoken publicly since. She left Los Angeles shortly after Nick's death in prison. No interviews. No statements. No social media. Just silence. And silence, in this story, has never meant peace. Because the next chapter isn't about voices in the walls. It's about proof. Photos. Messages. Evidence no one was supposed to see. And once those surfaced, the story stopped being about madness. And started becoming something much more deliberate. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It didn't start with a press release. It didn't start with police. It started with a leak. A single post on a private forum, buried between conspiracy threads and anonymous tips, with a title that looked almost harmless. Archive_014, a zip, mirror before it's gone. No explanation, no context, just a download link. And for the first few hours, almost no one noticed. But once a handful of users opened the file, everything changed. Inside were images, dozens of them, some blurry, some sharp, some taken in low light, others unervingly clear. And every single one of them appeared to have been taken inside the Reiner property. The timestamps stretched back months, long before the murders, long before anyone thought to look. At first glance, the photos seemed mundane. Hallways, doors, corners of rooms. But the longer you looked, the stranger they became. A hallway photograph from the same angle, night after night. The same chair in the guest house, always centered. The same doorway, slightly ajar. Captured at different times, different lighting. Why photograph nothing? Unless you're trying to document something that isn't always there. Then came the photos that made people stop scrolling. One image showed the kitchen late at night. Lights off. Only the glow from the refrigerator. And reflected faintly in the glass. Two figures. One clearly Nick. The other, impossible to identify. Too tall. Too indistinct. And positioned where no one should have been standing. Behind him. Another image showed the guest house interior. The same single chair from the recordings. But this time, the chair wasn't empty. It faced the camera. And on it sat a notebook. Open. On the visible page were 3 words, handwritten in thick black ink. IT listens back. That image spread faster than any of the others. Screenshots. Zoom-ins. Endless debates. Was it staged? Was it fake? Or was it evidence of something Nick believed was very, very real? As the archive spread, people began noticing patterns. The photos weren't random. They followed a sequence. Almost like a diary, except instead of words, it used images. Night after night. Room after room. And always the same progression. Empty space. Presence implied. Then disruption. One series showed the living room of the main house. First photo. Clean, untouched. Second, cushions slightly shifted. Third, a lamp angled differently. Fourth, a family photo turned face down. No fingerprints. No signs of struggle. Just interference. As if someone wanted to be noticed. Now let's talk about the image that forced moderators to lock entire threads. A photograph taken in the main hallway. You can see framed family portraits lining the wall. Rob, Michelle, Romy, Nick. But in this image, one frame is missing. In its place, a dark rectangle. As if the photo had been removed and something else had been standing there long enough to leave an outline. People argued endlessly about what it meant. Some said it was lighting. Others said it was digital manipulation. But those who had seen the entire archive noticed something chilling. That same rectangle appeared in multiple images, always in different rooms, always at roughly the same height. As attention grew, so did the panic. Because embedded in the metadata of the files were notes. Short phrases. Not captions. Not titles. More like reminders. Not yet. She feels it. Too much noise. Wait for quiet. And then one note that appeared again and again. Almost clean. When journalists caught wind of the archive, most refused to touch it. Too speculative. Too disturbing. Too risky. But one independent reporter, working under a pseudonym, claimed to have verified at least part of the material. He said the camera model matched one purchased by Nick months earlier. He said the timestamps aligned with known dates when Nick was alone on the property. And most unsettling of all, he said some of the photos were taken from angles Nick physically couldn't reach on his own. Too high, too far back, unless the camera had been placed and left. Then came the messages. Because the archive wasn't just photos. It contained screenshots of text drafts, notes, unsent messages, fragments of thoughts Nick never shared publicly. One read, "They think I'm documenting decay. I'm not. I'm documenting arrival." Another, "It doesn't like pictures, but it tolerates them." And another, dated just 4 days before the murders, "They won't listen. The house is full now." People began asking a new question. Not what did Nick do, but what did Nick think was happening? Because belief, especially when shared, can be powerful, dangerous, contagious. Then something else surfaced. A photo taken from inside the guest house, aimed toward the main house at night. All the lights are off, except one, the kitchen, and standing in the doorway, Michelle. Her back to the camera. She appears to be talking to someone, but no one else is visible. And the caption attached to that image? "Last warning. Now pause here." Imagine seeing that image after what we know happened. Imagine recognizing your mother in a photo labeled like that. Investigators would later say this image alone convinced them the murders were not impulsive. They were anticipated, expected, maybe even rehearsed. As the archive spread, it didn't just spark fear. It sparked imitation. People started posting their own photos, claiming similar experiences, claiming similar whispers, claiming similar presences. The story escaped the Reiner house and became something bigger. A narrative, a myth. And myths don't care about facts. They care about resonance. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the archive vanished. Links dead, threads locked, accounts deleted. Within 48 hours, it was gone. Except it wasn't. Because by then, it had already been saved, copied, re-uploaded, and studied. But the most chilling detail didn't come from the images. It came from what was missing. There were no photos dated after the murders. None. As if whatever Nick had been documenting stopped being visible once his parents were gone. Which leads to a terrifying implication. What if the photos weren't documenting madness? What if they were documenting a process? One that had reached its conclusion. And then came the final twist. Weeks after Nick's death in prison, a new image appeared online. From an unknown source. No metadata. No timestamp. Just a photo. It showed the guest house chair. Empty. Facing the camera. And taped to the back of it, a single piece of paper. With 4 words written in black ink. Quiet doesn't last. People debated endlessly whether it was fake. A hoax. A sick joke. But those who'd followed the archive from the beginning noticed something no one else did. The handwriting matched Nick's perfectly, which raises a question no one wants to answer. If Nick was dead, who was still taking pictures? And why did they want the world to see them now? Because in the next chapter, we're going inside the place that was supposed to silence Nick forever. The prison, the cell, the hours before his death. And what happened there suggests the story didn't end when the doors locked. It may have only changed locations. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. There's a saying in prison, time doesn't pass. It watches you. And for Nick Reiner, time watched like a hawk. From the moment he was booked into Los Angeles County Jail, the air around him changed. The whispers followed. The tension sharpened. This wasn't just another high-profile inmate. This was Hollywood blood, a name known in every household. A man accused of murdering 2 of the most beloved names in entertainment. But it wasn't just what Nick had done. It was how he behaved after. Like he wasn't afraid. Like he already knew what was coming. Nick was placed in protective custody immediately, not for his sake, for theirs. Other inmates didn't like child killers. They didn't like celebrity types. And they really didn't like someone who strolled into jail looking like he had nothing to lose. But here's what no one expected. Nick didn't fight, didn't cry, didn't beg. He walked in like a man stepping into a hotel lobby, eyes forward, shoulders square. When the intake officer asked if he had any medical conditions, he said one word: listening. The officer thought he meant hearing. Nick clarified: no, listening. It's not a condition. It's a burden. That was day 1, and it was just the beginning. Nick was placed in solitary. Cell 4B, Block D, 8 by 10, concrete floor, steel bed, one thin mattress, a toilet, a slit of a window with no view. Standard for his risk level. But by day 3, guards started filing incident reports. Nick wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating. He just sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the door, sometimes for hours. No books, no exercise, no requests. He said nothing, unless they asked a question. And even then, he answered with riddles. A prison nurse reported the first real event on day 6. She was performing a routine wellness check when Nick looked up and asked, "Do you know what sound a house makes when it exhales?" She thought he was being poetic. Then he said, "It's not wind. It's regret." Later that night, she filed a mental health flag. But the psychologist assigned to his case delayed the consult, claiming Nick was too passive to be a threat. That decision would later be listed in the internal review as a critical oversight. Let's pause here, because what Nick did next is either the most terrifying proof of his unraveling, or a sign that something was guiding him, even behind bars. It started with drawings. Scratches, really. Etched into the concrete with a broken pencil tip he'd smuggled in from booking. The first was simple, a spiral, over and over again, about the size of a coaster, just above the cot. But then came the others. Circles with lines crossing through, vertical shapes that looked like towers or eyes, and one symbol that guards described as a staircase that goes nowhere. He never spoke about them, but he redrew them constantly, as if he had to, as if they required it. Then the whispers started. Not Nick's, the inmates, from nearby cells. One claimed he'd heard Nick speaking Latin. Another said Nick didn't talk at all, but that sounds answered him. One man in cell 4A, just next door, filed a formal complaint. He said Nick hummed the same note all night, and that the sound made his ears bleed. The prison doctor examined him. No damage, no symptoms, no explanation. Just a man crying, saying, "It's still in my head. It doesn't leave." They moved him 2 blocks over. But the humming? It stayed. On day 12, the psychologist finally saw Nick. The session was brief. He sat down, opened his notepad, asked Nick to describe how he was feeling. Nick responded, "Ready." The psychologist asked, "Ready for what?" Nick looked at the wall. "To stop carrying her." The doctor asked who her was. Nick didn't answer, but he smiled. From that day on, Nick refused meals. He drank water. Nothing more. They tried to intervene, threatened forced feeding. He said, "If you feed the body, you starve the voice." No one knew what that meant. Not until they searched his cell a second time. Tucked under the mattress, they found a piece of paper. Small, torn, folded in half. On it, in small, frantic handwriting, were the words, "She sleeps under the floor. When she wakes, I will be clean." The floor was checked. Nothing there. But when the warden reviewed Nick's previous statements from the police station, he noticed a pattern. Nick kept referencing below. "Look under me." Not in the walls, under. It comes up from the dirt. It wasn't just metaphor anymore. It was obsession. Then came day 17, the day everything changed. That morning, Nick was quieter than usual. Still, tense. One guard described it as the air was coiled around him. Surveillance showed him sitting in the same position for over 8 hours. Then, around 2:34 a.m., the lights in Block D flickered. Security footage cut out. For 42 minutes. No power loss. No system errors. Just black. And when the cameras came back, Nick was dead. Let's talk about what they found. His body was discovered curled on the cot, arms wrapped around his chest, face pale. No blood at first glance. But when they rolled him over, multiple stab wounds to the back and side. Deep, jagged, some overlapping. 13 in total, each in a slightly different direction. No weapon found. No fingerprints. No signs of forced entry. The door had remained locked. No one went in. And yet, Nick was dead. Now remember, the room had been sealed. One way in, one way out. Security insisted there was no breach. So how was he stabbed? Was it self-inflicted? The medical examiner ruled that out instantly. The angle of the wounds made it physically impossible. He would have needed a second person, but there wasn't one. At least not one anyone could account for.